This moment offers us an opportunity to actually rethink the neglect and fraying of the social fabric. And what does it mean and what does it take for communities to thrive?
Josh Yates, thank you so much for joining me and VMDO for our Checking In With series.
I've always liked VMDO, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Josh, how does your research and your work at the intersection of Thriving Cities Group and at Duke University inform the way you see the world, especially now during our current crisis?
I'm trained as a cultural sociologist, and I have spent the last roughly 2 decades studying the question about what does it mean and what does it take for communities to thrive. And in the course of that work, I think you could boil it down to basically 2 key insights. That when humans are put at the center of the things we're designing, whether those are buildings or programs, and that growth and development are thought of in ecological terms, which is not to mean environmental, but rather in holistic ways and inclusive ways, communities thrive. And when they're not, they struggle to thrive. I founded a group called the Thriving Cities Group, and its focus is to take those 2 key insights and turn them into tools and frameworks that empower leaders and organizations to work for thriving in their communities. We can think about the pre-existing crises that existed in questions around healthcare or higher education or political polarization or inequality. COVID-19 is not creating any of those things, but simply revealing that those fault lines already existed, is intensifying the experience of them, and I think also accelerating the timeframes with which many who were dealing with them are having to confront them in really profound ways.
Josh, as a cultural sociologist, how do you see this current pandemic?
I tend to think of it in ways you might say are climatological. And so is it a blizzard? Is it a winter? Or is it a mini ice age? And each of those have a different orientation to not just how we understand the nature of COVID-19, but how we respond to it. So in the beginning of all of this, I had to convince my kids that this was not an extended snow day, that this had a reality to it that was bigger and more long-term than just a blizzard, right? It comes, we hunker down, and then eventually it goes and we get back to life as normal. And it's kind of like a snow day, an extended snow day. A winter, on the other hand, says that this is a prolonged season. And you have to you don't just you do hunker down in winter, but your activity and your behavior changes for a long extended period of time. Or is it something like a mini ice age in which it is a long winter. It's so long that it not only changes our behavior and activities in a given for a given season, but it actually shifts ways of living, right? You don't go back, when you come out of the mini ice age, you don't go back to normal. And so we have people who are approaching this in 3 different ways, using those metaphors. How we understand the nature of this crisis will determine our responses to it.
What big picture guidance might you give leaders, owners, or architects who are designing public facilities for our post-pandemic world?
I would say I have 4 basic thoughts. And this would be true, just to be clear, both for those designers and architects of our physical places and those people who are equally concerned with our programs and initiatives that can bring us together in those places. So I think it spans the whole spectrum of how we might think about design and building. But the first is, I would call it taking the title of a recent book and essay, It's Time to Build. So this would be my first point. Our lack of preparedness for COVID, in part, stems from decades-long neglect of investing in building the infrastructures that support common life, right? That's the key. That it's time to not simply protest, we need to do some of that too, but to roll our sleeves up and get to work to build and reinvest. The second point that I think is so important is how we build, not just that we build. How we build. We have to build with human people at the center of how we build. And we have to build in such a way that we have in view the whole system in view, the whole ecosystem in view, or the whole community in view. So we're not just building a widget right over here, isolated by itself, but we're building something that's going to be in conversation with the larger picture, with the larger common good. And then the third point is that we have to build with what I'm calling the third horizon in mind. And here's what I mean by that. Right now, we're thinking almost entirely and rightly about the first horizon of the response to the crisis, right? Everybody is trying to figure out, how do we survive if we're an organization or a small business, or how do I keep a job? The second horizon, you could think of that as the recovery. Where do we go next? How do we get out of this and get quote unquote back to normal, right? We hear this a lot. So how do we recover from this and get back to normal? But the third horizon, and this is where I think the leadership challenge is, because not many people have the luxury right now, at least it's often interpreted as a luxury, I actually think it's a necessity, to think about the third horizon, which is to say, how do we not just recover from this and quote unquote get back to normal, but what's the normal we want to get back to? How do we reframe, right? And re-envision the normal we want to build toward. And then the last one is also critical, which is that we also have to be thinking carefully about that we're not just building for, but we're building with, right? This is the critical importance. We all know the history of that, and it's fraught and filled with all kinds of missteps. So I think that we're in this enormously positive moment in the midst of all of the real human suffering and real human and community struggle. But there is, in the midst of this, these green shoot opportunities of rolling our sleeves up, of building with humans at the center, of building towards that third horizon, of reimagining and reframing what the back to normal might mean for us, and to do it with others, not for others. So that's the song I'm singing, and the good work that I think we have before all of us.
What can we learn from this pandemic that you've seen that indicate a possible future with more equitable, thriving communities for all?
I see two roads in front of us. One road you might think of as the Great Reset, right? This opportunity to reimagine and reset our communities on many different fronts, on many different issues, whether it's racial disparity or economic inequality or the kinds of political polarization and partisanship that's so divisive and so dividing. And then there's this other equally true possibility of what they call the great snap back, which is to say we recover from this crisis, right? We open up and we make it through and we just go back to normal, quote unquote, right? We go back to the way it was, which for many people is a good thing, but it can bring, it doesn't change the status quo. So what gives me hope is that everywhere I look, in every community that I know, I see countless people from countless walks of life and in every sector who deeply desire a great reset, who don't want to simply go back to normal. And so I put my hope in those people who are not just wanting it, but rolling their sleeves up every day to work for it.
Josh, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.